Good afternoon. Welcome to Great Decisions 2021, sponsored by World Affairs Council of St. Louis. My name is Joel Glassman. I'm the Vice President of the World Affairs Council of St. Louis, and it's my pleasure to serve as your host for this program. I'd like to begin by thanking the University of Missouri St. Louis and their international office, UMSL Global, for their support in partnering with World Affairs St. Louis for many years to present this program to our St. Louis audience. World Affairs St. Louis is a nonprofit, nonpartisan membership organization that connects St. Louis metropolitan region to the world. Founded in 1948, our mission is to offer programs which promote understanding, engagement, relationships, and leadership in world affairs. Great Decisions itself is a national program of the Foreign Policy Association, which was founded in 1918. The Great Decisions program is more than 70 years old, and it provides the opportunity for U.S. audiences to learn about and understand the complex foreign policy issues of our time. Foreign Policy Association and Great Decisions operate on the principle that an informed citizenry is essential for a democratic society. Great Decisions is the largest US-based discussion program about foreign policy. It has been the honor and privilege of World Affairs St. Louis to serve as the local host for this important program for more than a decade. Today's agenda will be as follows. We will start with a few minutes of an introductory video made by the Foreign Policy Association. We will then have an approximately 30-minute lecture by our guest speaker, Dr. Deborah Leiter. That will be followed by a question and answer period, and then at the end of the Q&A session, we will view the balance of the Foreign Policy Association video. Today's topic is Brexit and the EU, a topic of such, let's just say, notoriety that it's hardly essential to tell you about it or to summarize it for your benefit. Everybody who's interested in foreign policy and world affairs knows that Brexit is one of the great challenges facing Europe and the United States. Now let's watch the introductory portion of the Foreign Policy Association video.
The text of the referendum was just 16 words long. Should the United Kingdom remain a member of the European Union or leave the European Union? When a divided nation voted narrowly to leave, 650 members of parliament were left to figure out how. After 3.5 years of controversies, delays, resignations, extensions, and frustrations, Parliament finally ratified a withdrawal agreement in January 2020. But the ramifications of Brexit are far from fully settled. Now, Great Decisions asks where a fractured Britain can go from here. Britain after Brexit, next on Great Decisions.
Great Decisions is produced by the Foreign Policy Association in association with Thomson Reuters. Funding for Great Decisions is provided by the Herford Foundation, PricewaterhouseCoopers LLP, and the Nelson B. Delavan Foundation.
Even when it was all over, the years of contentious negotiations finally complete, the mood inside the European Parliament chamber was bitterly divided. As Eurosceptic representatives turned their backs, other lawmakers wiped back tears, held hands, and burst into song. The Brexit vote rocked an institution that seemed to be flying high. In 2012, the EU had won the Nobel Peace Prize for its role in bringing Europe together.
Europe, which is the place where world wars began, has been conflict-free since the development of the European Union.
So the idea of it as a peace project, you remember that for most countries in continental Europe, they had experienced close to 100 years of war. But for the UK, peace was brought about by the UK as a sovereign nation.
When it starts to develop the qualities of a state, of a nation state to some extent, or a confederation at least, winning Nobel Peace Prizes for its foreign policy, these start to actually put question marks in many people's minds, or Eurosceptic minds in the UK.
Eurosceptic sentiment was spreading across the continent. Britain was only one of a dozen countries where prominent politicians were calling for the EU's demise.
I mean, in the rest of the EU, Eurosceptic parties never talked about leaving the EU, now they are. An opinion poll in the Netherlands said that a majority there now want to leave. So we may well be close, perhaps, to Nexit. And similarly in Denmark, a majority there are in favour of leaving, so we could be quite close to Dexit. And I'm told the same may apply to Sweden and perhaps Austria and perhaps even Italy too.
We were told that we were the first of many, and soon there would be a Frexit from France and a Plexit from Poland, and this was just the first of many. But I mean, to be honest, it's an unprecedented thing.
And those who have talked about their countries leaving, like Marine Le Pen in France or others, now don't really do so because it is seen as so difficult.
In the course of the years since the Brexit vote, has been a bit of a shock, I think, to the world in terms of the incompetence on display in so many institutions. That said, I think that Brexit has also served to alert the EU to the dangers of an EU which does not take seriously the concerns of its member countries.
In Britain, as in much of Europe, surveys show that young people are the most invested in the European project.
All the polling evidence shows that the younger you are, the more likely you are to be pro-European. They argued that they had no say in this, whereas someone who was aged 100 in 2016, who may not be with us anymore, had more of a say over a profound decision that would affect their future to live and love and work and rest and play in 27 other nation states.
The young are only young for a certain length of time, because as they get older, they'll support the Conservative Party. What is happening here is that the young have slightly misunderstood what will happen after Brexit in terms of cultural links, and these will still continue.
What we're seeing in a graphic blip, an older population that turns out disproportionately to vote, that holds views that are disproportionately anti-migrant, racially conservative, anti-internationalism, and young people who know better.
The generational divide raises the question of whether Britain might someday seek to return to the European fold.
Because of the way our electoral system works, although 50% of people voted for Remain parties, the Leave side won, and we've left now. So I think it's not going to be any time soon.
Lots of people think there is a prospect of Britain begging to go back into the European Union, just as it did in the 70s and the 60s. But actually, I think it's incredibly difficult. And this is the challenge. Britain has yet to find a stable spot in the world after the Second World War.
Britain itself is going to face enormous challenges just staying together. But similarly, the European Union will have to evolve. What kind of EU will emerge? Will it be a multi-speed Europe, where some countries are much more tightly integrated and others are less so? All of these things, we will have to see how they play out. But I think it's entirely plausible that in a generation from now, Britain will ask to rejoin whatever the EU has evolved into.
Let me now introduce our distinguished speaker for today's program, Dr. Deborah Leiter is an associate professor of political science at the University of Missouri, Kansas City. She's been a faculty member there since 2013. She earned her PhD at the University of California, Davis. She's a specialist in electoral and party politics, especially in Europe. She's presented many public lectures and made many media appearances presenting about elections, including the very, very important and critical Brexit election that we're going to be discussing today. As I said previously, she'll speak for approximately 30 minutes, and that'll be followed by a Q&A session. Please send your questions to me through the Q&A option on your Zoom screen. I will direct the questions to Dr. Leiter in hopefully bunching together some of your questions, grouping them together in order to keep our program moving more quickly. Now it's my pleasure to present to you Dr. Deborah Leiter.
Thank you so much for that wonderful introduction. Let me get my screen shared for everybody. All right. So let me take you all back. So my name is Dr. Deborah Leiter, as said, and let me take you all back to June of 2016. So in June of 2016, I found myself in Brussels for the European Political Science Association annual conference. And the night before the referenda, I bid adieu to my European friends and got on to get together the next day and drink a toast to a wild referenda that we were all certain would lead to the status quo. The next morning, I awoke to a plethora of emails and text messages, and I walked to the conference site to see the shocked faces of my European colleagues. Because the unthinkable had happened. After almost half a century of membership in the European Union, the UK had voted to leave. And about 5 years later, we are now finally into just about the first 100 days of the UK out of the European Union. So I thought it might be useful for us to take a quick step back and look at how we got to the Brexit decision, the complex process of its negotiations, where we're at and where we might be in the future. So really fast, just to start with what is Brexit, which is, by the way, one of the most Googled questions in the UK the day after the referenda. Brexit is a portmanteau for British exit, and it was a decision by referenda for the United Kingdom to leave the European Union. While the referenda was back in June of 2016, we didn't actually see the UK leave officially until December 31st, 2020, when the transition period ended, and we now today have what we might consider to be a British exit from the EU. So the first question we might ask is, what led to Brexit? Why did the EU even consider, the UK even consider leaving the EU? And the truth of the matter is that the UK and the EU have always had a contentious relationship. All the way back in 1973, they were a late joiner, coming in about 2 decades after the sort of initial creation of the European Union, or European Community at that point. And they were always considered sort of the awkward partner. They were never fully integrated. They didn't join the monetary union. They had a number of limitations applied. It's also worth noting that there seemed to be a real dislike or even hatred of the European Union by a number of political elites, and especially the British press. In fact, this image you see on the screen is a screenshot of an official European Parliament website dedicated solely to correcting Euro myths. And these were myths, truths, or downright lies that the British press reported about the European Union. And if you want to know more about that, ask me about bananas in the Q&A. In addition to sort of the general desire for an answer to whether the UK should remain in the EU, there were partisan reasons for this as well. There was a lot of Conservative Party infighting about the European Union. It really divided the party. And David Cameron at the time thought that the best way to deal with this infighting was to push the decision off onto voters who would likely vote to remain, and then they could move on. In addition, of course, we have the growth of the United Kingdom and Independence Party led by Nigel Farage, who in 2014 had become the largest British party in the European Parliament. So there was a lot of tension about the issue of the European Union on the lead up to the referendum. But very few people thought it would pass. So why did it? And the answer is, in part, that there's always just been kind of a general suspicion about the EU and the UK, as I've mentioned. Surveys throughout the British membership in the European Union showed that Europeans were much more attached to the European Union than the British public. In fact, there's only a few times ever in the British history of membership of the European Union that they ever had even above a 50% approval of EU membership. There's also generally a growing Euroscepticism in Europe across the board that was picked up on in the UK. We saw far-right parties, populist parties, even some far-left parties organizing against the European Union in more and more effective ways. But part of the story also has to look at the campaigns. The Leave campaign was more unified and simply more effective than the Remain campaign. The Leave campaign had a very clear message that something was being lost to the European Union and it could be regained. So it was very optimistic about the future, even if it was a little pessimistic about the current state of affairs. The Remain campaign was much more muddled. There were a lot of different forces, not a clear message about what the European Union would look like. And to the extent that they focused on anything, they focused on the things that you would lose if you left the European Union. In fact, it was such a negative campaign that it was nicknamed Team Gloom by the British press. And so there you can see David Cameron in front of a poster saying that the cost of leaving the EU is 4,300 British pounds for every person. So a combination of Euroscepticism, a long-term muddled relationship with the European Union, and very effective campaigning by the Leave campaign leads us to the result that we all now know occurred, which was a slim majority for leaving the European Union. Really high turnout, 72.2%, and quite a lot of variation in who voted for Brexit and who didn't. Now that Brexit had occurred, we can get to the process of negotiations. And here is where things get complicated. The day after the European Union referenda, David Cameron resigns. Job well done in losing the referenda. Theresa May is chosen by the Conservative Party to become the new prime minister. And initially, Theresa May is quite optimistic. She has a plan for Brexit. Her famous statement that she would come to regret later was, Brexit means Brexit. She was going to push for a hard Brexit, a clear separation of the UK and the EU. Her optimism is not met by political reality. And after about a 3-year period, she ends up resigning after failing to reach any agreement, and Boris Johnson is chosen. Boris Johnson initially has major challenges, but due to a combination of events I'll cover in a second, he is able to finally negotiate an agreement. So why was Theresa May unsuccessful in negotiating Brexit? Well, the answer is, I think in many ways, anyone in Theresa May's position probably would not have been successful. She did make a number of miscalculations, as she admits. She triggers Article 50 very early. Article 50 is the way in which a country can leave the European Union. And the thing that does is it sets a deadline for leaving of 2 years. Theresa May is very optimistic that she'll be able to get this done well in time. However, she decides that she needs a larger majority in her party in order to deliver Brexit effectively, and decides to hold a new election in 2017. And in doing so, she ends up losing her majority. She ends up having to form a government with the support of the Democratic Unionist Party, the DUP, which is a Northern Irish Unionist Party. So now Theresa May is stuck. She's lost a majority, and she has very little chance of getting any support from any member of parliament who wants to remain. Many of them believe that if they can stop negotiations from occurring, they can have a second referenda on the type of deal and potentially even stop Brexit from happening. Within Theresa May's own party, however, the European Research Group, the really strong pro-Brexiteers, were very skeptical of May's deal. And some of them actually preferred what's called a no-deal Brexit, which would be Britain reverting to WTO arrangements in trading with the European Union, which most economists identify as just an absolutely horrible thing for the economy. But the European Research Group was willing to accept that. So Theresa May faced no support from any Leave members and divisions on her own side. And when she brings her first negotiated deal with the European Union to the UK Parliament, she receives the biggest government defeat in British parliamentary history. While she survives a vote of no confidence, she attempts 3 more times to bring her negotiated deal to Parliament and fails each time. Once it is revealed that they're going to have to participate in the European Parliament elections, Theresa May announces her resignation, and Boris Johnson takes over. Johnson is made the prime minister, and he initially actually has quite a bit of challenge in negotiating with the European Union. Theresa May had faced her own challenges, in part because the European Union had to make sure that it was a challenging negotiation. But Johnson is really having a tough time negotiating with the EU. He ends up actually doing a lot of negotiations with the Irish Prime Minister to develop new strategies, but realizes that as another deadline passes and another extension is called for, he needs a new majority and calls an election. And this time it's successful. This time Johnson is able to get a fairly sizable majority. What changed? I think people were just tired. They were tired of Brexit in the EU, in the UK and in the EU as well. And people were willing to, as the Conservatives promised in their campaign, do anything to get Brexit done. Once Johnson gets this large majority, he's able to get his new deal passed in Parliament pretty easily. And in January of 2020, he's able to pass a deal in Parliament that will then officially have the UK leaving the EU. Now, the reason that we don't consider this fully completed is that this starts a transition period of 1 year. So the Johnson government has 1 year to negotiate a deal about what the UK and the EU relationship will look like. And then COVID-19 happens. And as the lockdown begins, negotiations become fraught and perilous. And I will say for much of 2020, it did not seem likely that the Johnson government would be able to deliver a trade deal, that there was going to be major problems in the relationship with the European Union. It was really only around October and November when pressure placed on the European negotiators by Macron and Merkel got them to come back together to the negotiation table and hammer out an agreement in the matter of a month. The deadline for these negotiations to end is December 31st. And it was on December 24th of 2020 that they finally had a signed agreement between the UK and the EU. Passes in Parliament and is considered active as of January 1st. We got there, finally and painfully. This process was so fraught that actually recently the Harvard Business Review published an article saying how not to negotiate, and using Brexit as an example of the failures of negotiations, primarily on the British team, but also on the European team. Okay, so we've got there. We have an agreement, we have a negotiation. The question is, what is it? And what it is called officially is the EU-UK Trade and Cooperation Agreement. And this agreement is somewhere between the no-deal Brexit and some of the more mild forms of relationships proposed, say the Norway Agreement. We can essentially describe this as a broad economic partnership and a free trade zone. That's just, I think, the way to mostly understand it. There's a free trade zone that is established between the UK and the European Union. And they also have agreed to broadly cooperate on future issues in order to create a sense of an equal playing field. The one thing that was really key for both the UK and the EU was to not have them sort of engage in behaviors that would lead to really nasty competitive processes. They didn't want to sort of cut labor prices or standards in such a way that would affect each other's competitiveness on the global market. So there's no formal perfect agreement here. It is a broad agreement of general cooperation. Certain protections were granted for UK nationals living in the EU, and the reverse was true as well. EU nationals living in the UK as of the date of exit were granted important protections. At the same time, it is important to understand that this is the end of the UK's membership in the EU. The free movement of people and labor has ended. In order for labor to enter the UK or the EU, they're going to have to get workers' permits and visas, which is quite a change from the current status quo, or the previous status quo. And it is also the end of the customs union. So free trade agreements are not the same thing as a customs union. Customs unions are sort of a stronger, lower barrier form of an agreement. The free trade agreement does place certain types of barriers. The exception to that is Northern Ireland. Northern Ireland has been the key sticking piece to negotiations with the European Union. And essentially what they have created is de jure placing Northern Ireland in the trade zone of the United Kingdom, but de facto keeping Northern Ireland in the European Union's customs union. And that includes things like shared power, regulations on certain types of industries, etc. And all of this was designed to try to create, or excuse me, avoid a hard border between Northern Ireland and the Republic of Ireland. So that's sort of a general summary of what the UK-EU cooperation agreement is. In the agreement, what we do see is some interesting gains for both the UK and the EU. Now, one thing that the EU wanted to ensure, and this is, I think, was very important for them, and I think we can largely say they were successful, is they wanted to make sure that the negotiation process was painful and hard. And they wanted that to ensure that the threats being brought up by other Eurosceptic parties in Europe were sort of put in proper light. So certainly one of the things you can see in the UK-EU deal is the sort of challenge of this negotiation. Really fascinating to me, when you read the EU summary of the EU-UK deal, at the end of every paragraph, there's a sentence that reads something like, "While this is good for the UK, it is not as good as it would be if they were a member state." So they're really important part of their branding. But the big gain for both the UK and the EU is no hard border for Ireland, with Ireland. This was really important. Avoiding reignition of conflict in Northern Ireland was a goal of both parties to negotiations. And as we'll see in a moment, this has been a complex issue, and it's not certain that they have fully solved it, but they've come up with at least a temporary solution. They also negotiated a level playing field on economic issues, environmental issues, transportation, and workers' rights, basically making it so that you can't undercut each other by really cutting your quality expectations here in such a way that you incentivize people to trade with you versus the EU. There are some questions about how this will be enforced, but a principle of a level playing field has been really emphasized by both parties. Really importantly, and this was the biggest gain for the UK, is zero tariffs and zero quota on trade goods. So when there are these trades, we're talking about a tax-free zone. So there's no additional cost for trading between the EU and the UK on certain types of goods. The European Court of Justice has been pulled out. This was always a important part of the deal. The British government had often believed that the European Court of Justice was sort of treating them unequally. So having the ECJ not be a part of resolving trade disputes was a key stumbling block in May's deal. EU gives up 25% of its fisheries quotas for 5 years. So this is not as much as the UK wanted, and it was more than the EU wanted. So if neither party is happy, we can call it a gain for both. Protection of EU nationals in the UK and vice versa was really important. And we also see that the UK will continue to participate in certain types of EU programs, especially scientific cooperation. So there are a lot of things that both parties can point to and say we did well, but there are also a number of things that have led people to be a little bit more skeptical. There's a customs and regulatory checks will exist. And while the level of delay that may induce is variable, that does mean that there is a delay in shipping between the European Union and the UK and vice versa. And for goods that are fragile or timely, like seafood or flowers, this can be quite a big deal. There are also additional rules of origin requirements. That's the big difference between a customs union and a free trade agreement, which means that supply chain issues may end up being quite a big deal for the UK and the EU in the future. One area that was considered to be a big miss for the UK is that there's no automatic recognition of professional qualifications. This means the European Union doesn't have to recognize, say, your educational degrees as being the same value. So I can't just go to the UK, to say Belgium and practice dentistry with my UK license in a way that I was able to before. End of the freedom of movement was, of course, something that was brought up quite a bit. It's going to affect travel between the two regions, tourism, and labor practices. And a return to temporary visas means that working across these areas is going to be more challenging and less certain. Because we're in an educational setting, I'll say that the end of the Erasmus participation for the UK is a particular blow, that the UK will not be able to recruit European Union students with the ease that they were able to before, and European students will not be able to gain access to British universities with the same ease. So that's where we are, and we're done with Brexit, right? Everything's solved, we're finished, everything's great. No. No, we're not, unfortunately. I'll note just a couple of issues that are yet to be resolved. The European Parliament has not officially signed on to the deal. They are still reading it through, and they actually just delayed it again. So we are actually not officially in the new deal yet. And recent fights over the AstraZeneca vaccine and UK unilateralism actually did threaten to restart a hard border in Northern Ireland. So that's been a big issue. And while both parties backed off, the fact that we got as close as we did to reactivating a hard border only 3 months into the new negotiations reflects a lot of challenges to come. And already the EU is taking the UK to court over violations of the agreement. Beyond that, there's still many areas left to be negotiated. Big areas to small areas, security issues, data sharing, services, professional qualifications, and always and forever in the EU, fisheries are going to prove to be complicated. Britain's ended up wanting the deal to be accepted, but they don't particularly care for it. And that's sort of where we are at with the deal. What complications do we see for the UK post-Brexit? Well, there's concerns about economic growth, whether the United Kingdom can remain united, and trade partnerships with the US. A key element of the Johnson strategy and promise was that the UK would be able to deliver a swift trade agreement with the United States. But a lot of evidence suggests they're not going to be able to do that. We know that the Trump administration placed a higher priority in UK trade deals than the Biden administration does. The Biden administration has signaled already that they're more focused on cooperation with the European Union in general for issues like climate change, for security issues with China and Russia, than they are focused on a UK trade deal. So to say that relationships in the United States are worse under Biden is not correct, but to say that the priority of focusing on the UK probably has declined with Biden's election. A lot of evidence to suggest already that there are going to be major economic issues related to Brexit. We can see this with the valuation of the pound, which of course dropped drastically after Brexit and did recover for a bit, but has dropped its value again and has not recovered its valuation that it had prior to Brexit. We are already starting to see European firms no longer trading with the UK, and we're starting to see delays in shipping, especially on vulnerable industries affecting the British economy. British trade dropped about 12% the first month of the new deal, compared to about 8% for everybody else. And while that's recovered a little bit, we don't see the types of recovery we would expect for this to just be, as the Johnson administration refers to it, a teething problem. Can the UK remain united? It's a big question. Scotland is probably the first country that might leave the United Kingdom. They disproportionately voted for Remain and consistently preferred remaining in the EU compared to the rest of the country. And as we can see, Scottish independence has become an incredibly salient issue for the Scottish public. These are some surveys asking about how people would vote in an independence referendum. And what we can see is, while actually right after Brexit, people had sort of softened their demand for Scottish independence, kind of adopting a wait and see approach. As the Scottish elections come up on May the 6th, more and more demands for independence are occurring. And we're likely to see independence-oriented parties become the majority party in the Scottish Parliament, which could lead to demands for a new independence referendum. We are actually even seeing in Wales, which voted disproportionately to remain in, to leave, more and more demands for Welsh independence. It's nowhere near the Scottish levels, but the fact that it's on the rise is a reflection of some of these challenges. Northern Ireland is always going to be complex. It was always going to be a problem regardless, and it was a sticking point during the campaign and throughout negotiations. Northern Ireland voted primarily on sectarian lines. So folks that the Republican forces tended to vote primarily for Remain. The Unionist forces were more divided, but were the ones who were more likely to vote Leave. So there's already a division in Northern Ireland. And the complexities of the backstop have led to a sort of perspective that has actually increased demands for Northern Ireland to leave the UK and join the Republic of Ireland. It's actually now tied, demands to remain versus stay. And that's the first time that's happened for a while. Add to that the outbreaks of violence and the riots that we've seen in Northern Ireland in the last few weeks, and the rejection of the protocol by unionist parties. We're likely to see conflict in Northern Ireland be a centerpiece of conflict for the UK and the EU relationship for some time to come. I'll end with this thought, which is, what's the EU doing after all this? And there's a lot of debate, but Brexit may actually have been good for the EU. We're actually seeing more support for staying in the European Union after Brexit than we ever did beforehand. People saw the value in the European Union in a way when they saw how hard it was to leave. And while populist forces remain very powerful on the continent, we're starting to see signs of their slippage. in many places in Europe, although certainly France has a lot of people's attention brought to it. And since I can see that I'm sort of running low on time, I'll say that some European Union scholars see that the UK leaving the EU was bad for it, but the UK was the awkward partner. There's more unity amongst the European Union today than there has been in the past. And it's possible that by leaving the European Union, the UK may have strengthened it in ways they never thought possible. Thank you all so much for your time.
Thank you very much, Professor Leiter. We appreciate it. We have a number of questions that have already come in through the Q&A function, and please please send some more. Our first question is whether the bureaucratic barriers that have come about as a result of Brexit have had a significant, have placed a significant burden on small businesses in the UK. Could you give us your assessment of that?
That's a great question. And particularly the phrasing small businesses is key, because that is who economic reports have shown have been the most affected by this sort of new bureaucracy. All businesses had a challenge for Brexit in that they essentially only had 6 days to figure out the new regulations for trading with the EU. But larger businesses had more resources to sort of put in changing over and dealing with these new regulations. Small businesses had a very, very hard time. And we're seeing a decline in small businesses, especially in, as I mentioned, sort of the time-sensitive businesses in the UK. Fisheries, agriculture, floral trade, agricultural trade have all reported major drops. We're also seeing major problems in the shipping industry, not just a decline in the number of goods being sent from the UK to the EU, but a number of those trucks are returning empty for the first time in decades. And so because so many shipping industry businesses are also run by small businesses, that's one of the areas where we're really seeing a big impact. The UK actually just changed some of their regulations about how truck shipping works. So that might have a positive impact, might speed things up, but definitely it is the small businesses that have had the biggest dip because these changes are challenging, and a lot of EU businesses have changed their supply chain in response to them.
Has the development of the AstraZeneca vaccine in the UK, what's been the overall reaction in the EU? Are they admiring the scientific prowess involved in the development of the vaccine, or are they irritated about British efforts to treat this as a proprietary matter?
I think if there was anything that was going to bring down UK and EU relationships, it might be the AstraZeneca vaccine. The EU, I will say, it is no other way to say it. They absolutely botched vaccine distributions and orders. And one of the things that was very challenging was they sort of didn't expect AstraZeneca to put priority on UK distribution over EU distribution. So AstraZeneca failed to deliver a huge proportion of the EU's initial order. I think it was on the level of more than a 40% difference. And one of the things that almost shut down trade, almost started the hard border, was shipping AstraZeneca vaccines from the Republic of Ireland to Northern Ireland. They almost stopped that border down. So the relationship between the two has been very, very fraught over this, really has exacerbated tensions. I will say at the same time, interestingly, the UK's success in distributing vaccines has been good for the UK. We started to see UK governmental approval sort of spike up for the first time, given that they have been, in truth, more effective in distributing these vaccines. In fact, Northern Ireland is more vaccinated than the Republic of Ireland today. So a lot of tensions are being sort of focused on by AstraZeneca. And I do think there was just quite a bit of surprise on the EU's part at how much these divisions would matter for something like the distribution of a vaccine.
One of our audience members has asked you to describe in greater detail this hard border issue between Northern Ireland and Ireland.
Sure.
So can I ask you to do a little bit of work on that?
Absolutely. All right. So Northern Ireland shares a land border with the Republic of Ireland. And one of the things that helped to lead to the resolution of the conflict in Northern Ireland was the European Union. We focus a lot on the Good Friday Accords. They certainly mattered. But the Good Friday Accords were built in part on the European Union and the European Convention for Human Rights. So the free movement of peoples and goods sort of made it so that either side could make a claim to victory. Once a border exists, the free movement of peoples and goods cannot exist, right? There are border checks, there are checks of cars driving through, passport checks, etc. And the one thing that everyone sort of agreed on, Theresa May's deal, Boris Johnson's deal, the EU preferences, is they couldn't have a hard border on the land. That this would be the thing that would reignite conflict. So what they have is essentially no major border between them. They do spot checks of cars, they do certain types of checks of trucking, but for the most part, it looks pretty much today like it did 6 years ago between the Republic of Ireland and Northern Ireland. The tricky part was that in order to deal with this, because Northern Ireland is in the customs union with the EU, so they're sharing sort of trade standards, value-added tax standards, customs standards, there had to be some type of border between the rest of the UK and Northern Ireland. So what they now have is a sea border on the North Sea between the Republic of Ireland and Northern Ireland, and certain types of goods are being checked at the ports between the UK and Northern Ireland. So it's actually created a larger trade border between England, Scotland, and Wales and Northern Ireland than exists between Northern Ireland and the Republic of Ireland. And this is why we are seeing so much conflict emerge there, is that unionist forces in Northern Ireland are saying that you have essentially created a situation where we're more part of the European Union than we are the United Kingdom.
Okay,
and so that's
you.
what's going on right now. Yeah.
One of our audience members is remembering that negative feelings about immigration and refugees from Africa and the Middle East as one of the primary motivating factors in the Brexit vote. But of course, that vote was a long time ago. What are feelings like in the UK today about this immigration from Africa and the Middle East? Have feelings modulated, or are they still very intense?
We are seeing some of the saliency of that has gone down as sort of the height of the refugee crisis has ebbed. We are not seeing the same numbers of refugees coming through Europe and the United Kingdom that we were at the time of the referenda. I won't say it's not salient. Political identity remains a big salient part of British politics. In fact, they just had, the government just released a report on racism and xenophobia in the United Kingdom. And to the consternation of many observers, the government reported that they don't have a problem with racism and xenophobia in the United Kingdom. And I think the reactions to that speak about how much this remains an issue, because in essence, there was an idea of the United Kingdom's identity being weakened through immigration from Europe and other parts of the globe. And this does make it more challenging for immigrants or refugees coming in from the MENA region, the Middle East and North Africa, to make it to the UK by coming in through a back door through Europe. So it's not as salient as it was, but it has not gone away.
one of our audience members is interested in your projections of what would have happened if the Brexit vote had been done again. You're saying that the original question was very simple, perhaps overly simple, overly simplified, and the vote was still very close. If the Brexit vote was taken again today, what would have been the answer?
Well, I think when you would have given the second referenda would have affected what would have happened. So I'll say if they'd asked another yes, no, up, down referenda, probably sort of in the heart of the failed Brexit negotiations in 2019, things may have gone a different way. There are actually some people who suggest that if the Brexit referenda had happened a week later, it would have gone a different way. However, I would say by the time sort of the Johnson administration, or excuse me, the Johnson government has been elected and negotiated their deal, there was sort of a general acceptance of Brexit amongst most of the population. And it's not popular, but it was sort of accepted as what was going to come. Now, a different question is, what if you'd had a referenda on the type of Brexit people wanted? And I think that would have been really interesting. And what we would have seen was probably a victory for a much softer form of Brexit than what we ended up getting. Probably more likely to be involved in the customs union, protect free movement of peoples, etc. So I suspect that if we asked a question of not do you want Brexit, but what type of Brexit do you want, we would have potentially gotten quite a different answer. But it is remarkable, actually, even at the height of Brexit not going anywhere, most people said they would vote the same way they did.
Climate change is, of course, a big issue every place. Is it an issue between the UK and the EU?
So what they have tried to do is make an agreement that they're going to continue to cooperate at high levels. They're still, Britain's still remaining a signatory to the Paris Climate Accords. The challenge is that they have essentially have an agreement to agree. The sort of level of enforcement is unclear. And it's not really clear as yet what will happen if the UK wildly diverges from EU standards. That had been a major concern for the European Union. And in initial negotiations, they had pushed much harder for more constraint on the UK over climate change. But in the end, they sort of agreed to agree in the future. And I would not be so surprised if we learned that the UK and the EU have a conflict over this, and that while both the UK and the rest of the European Union tend to be more focused on climate change than the United States, or more in agreement, I should say, the UK is not quite as, we'll say, green as many of their sort of European counterparts. So I would expect eventually we're going to see that come into conflict.
The financial services sector is a very important part of UK business. There was a lot of expectation that the financial services sector in the UK would suffer as a result of Brexit. Has that actually happened?
We're starting to see signs of that happening. I think the financial services sector on its own did a number of things to try to help prepare for the transition. But that actually is, I think, the area that is most under negotiated right now. Certainly sort of analyses by economists of the EU-UK trade agreement said that there's many unanswered questions left. So we haven't seen quite the drop that many people expected. But I think that's because so many things have been left unnegotiated, and so the status quo was prevailing. As the agreement sort of enters force more fully, we're actually ending another extension period of that. I would not be surprised to see that there is a transition towards European financial services as the sort of delays become more effective. The UK has been saying that they're going to be more effective at expanding financial services outside of the European Union. That has been their focus. They've been negotiating with Japan quite a bit in this issue, for example. And so if they're successful there, that could be a net benefit for the UK. But if they're not, I expect we might see quite a financial dive for the UK. we haven't seen it quite at the speed we've seen, say, the fisheries industry have a decline.
The introduction to the Foreign Policy Association video made reference to expectations that other countries would follow the UK in leaving the EU. But of course, that vote was 5 years ago.
Right.
What's the status today? Are any other European countries heading towards exit from the European Union?
In the while Brexit was being negotiated, the idea of independence really got mentioned quite a bit less amongst the sort of populist movements in Europe. We certainly saw them continue to complain about the European Union, but emphasize independence a bit less. And in a number of countries, we're starting to see the populist parties begin to fragment a bit. The Netherlands just had an election recently. It was a very exciting one because it was so boring. The largest party became an even large party. The far right parties had sort of fragmented, maintaining about their vote share, losing it a little bit, but no longer cooperating. And actually pro-EU forces did surprisingly well. So we're starting to see in Netherlands, which has always had a little bit of Euroscepticism to it, sort of a recognition of the value of the European Union. Germany, polls indicate that potentially the far right is on the decline, and the competition is likely to be between the Christian Democrats and the Green Party. And they're actually, I would say, share fairly similar preferences over the European Union. France is the big X factor right now. Macron is, current president of France, Macron is particularly unpopular right now. He has about a 30% approval rating. And current polls show Marine Le Pen, the far-right leader, as the current polling leader. Now, she's been a polling leader before and lost, but there's quite a bit of concern in Europe that she may end up winning the presidency. And whether she would have France leave the European Union or simply kind of pull away, that's unclear. But for the most part, we're starting to see those sort of most extreme anti-Euro parties kind of losing steam.
What about the future of Germany's relationships, particularly with the impending retirement of Angela Merkel?
I think everyone in Europe is paying attention to Merkel's retirement. She's been such a force in European politics for so long. And I think especially during the Trump administration, when the United States had sort of pulled back from some of the sort of external leadership positions, Merkel was sort of forced to step in. And I say forced, she never seemed particularly excited to be considered a leader. She was always sort of turning to the EU to try to make sort of group decisions rather than unilateral ones. We don't actually even know yet if the Christian Democrats, her party, was to win, who would be the chancellor. There's sort of two candidates in Germany, the Christian Social Union candidate, their partner party, or the current leader in parliament. Neither of those two leaders are as well known. We don't really know exactly what their orientation towards the European Union is. I think if the current CDU leader ends up winning, we're going to see sort of more of the same. But I don't know if he'll have that sort of outsized influence that Merkel had earned by the end of her quite long tenure as chancellor. So I don't expect Germany to start pulling away from the European Union by any means, but it's not certain if the leadership of Germany will sort of step in the same way. And some of us are actually expecting that because Germany's leadership might be less poised to sort of lead the European Union, it might be a time for the European Commission, led by Ursula von der Leyen, to really step up and start to become this unifying political leadership that has been missing in the EU.
I think I'll take the privilege of asking you the last question. As Britain went through this torturous process of leaving the EU, there were almost daily opinion pieces and editorials describing the total failure of the British political process. They somehow didn't seem to know how to do it right. And I say this not from a perspective of either being pro-EU or anti-EU, but it seemed like a massive demonstration of incompetence and couldn't seem to go in either direction. And maybe a little too early to do a retrospective on this, but is there any long-term impact of this years-long struggle to move ahead in any direction?
I do think that there will be long-term repercussions. One thing that was quite interesting was that Parliament, rather than the government, really asserted its authority in ways that it hadn't before. And recently, the Johnson government has been trying to sort of reel that back in. So we're starting to see quite a backlash by the government, who in part used the coronavirus to expand the powers of the government over Parliament. But that's led to a fair amount of discontent. So I think we're in a period where we're either going to see the executive branch, the government, really take on an extremely concentrated amount of power that we haven't seen in the UK since the 80s, or we might see the reverse. And I think much of that is going to come down to what happens with things like Scotland. If Scotland gets a majority of independent support and ask for a referenda, and they don't get it, we are headed towards an important constitutional crisis that really could end up breaking the United Kingdom apart. But I also think we're going to start to see people move away from the parties that were unsuccessful in getting their preferences expressed. So the Labour Party is in quite a bit of trouble. They're going to have to rebrand very effectively if they want to be a continued political force in the future.
Well, thank you very much. I think this brings a close to Dr. Leiter's portion of the program, and I know you will join me in thanking her for a very comprehensive view of Europe, the EU, and the UK. So thank you, and we hope we can invite you back for the next crisis, perhaps the Scotland crisis, because you seem to have a lot to offer us. This program will resume on May 6th with Dr. George Zadison from the University of Missouri St. Louis, who will be discussing the global supply chain and national security. So I hope you'll be with us on June 6th. Thank you for joining us today, and please consider becoming a member of the World Affairs Council of St. Louis, because we need your continued participation. And now, please sit back and enjoy the balance of the Foreign Policy Association video about Brexit and the EU, and you can compare their tale with Dr. Leiter's presentation. Again, thank you, Dr. Leiter. We appreciate your participation.
As soon as Britain first joined the European Economic Community back in 1973, activists set to work trying to reverse that decision.
Euroscepticism as a movement didn't really emerge until sort of the mid to late 1980s, and it's often dated to a famous speech by Margaret Thatcher in Bruges, where she sort of articulated opposition to continued integration.
My first guiding principle is this: willing and active cooperation between independent sovereign states is the best way to build a successful European community. To try to suppress nationhood and concentrate power at the center of a European conglomerate would be highly damaging and would jeopardize the objectives we seek to achieve.
It became clear that there would have to be movements towards a political union in order to deal with the problems of the monetary union. That made the British very uncomfortable, because they could see that more and more powers were going to be moved to the European political union over time.
Britain was never invaded in the Second World War. Why do you suddenly need to give up your sovereignty to join in with those countries that have been invaded or defeated?
In the run-up to the 2016 referendum, campaigners clashed over divergent ideas about whether Britain's economy would benefit by leaving the EU.
Now is the time, I think, for my country, our country, the UK, to seize the opportunities of leaving the EU. We may be extricating ourselves from the treaties of the European Union. We are not leaving Europe.
The Leave campaign throughout promised that we could do better than being in the EU. I mean, our biggest trading partner is the European Union. That's 500 million people. And because we were in the EU, we had preferential deals with a whole load of countries. We were told that a minute to midnight in March 2018, the original leaving date, there would be 40 trade deals in place. And I think when that actually happened, there were 0.
They said that, for example, the NHS, which of course the National Health Service is beloved in Britain, always underfunded, and they said, well, we're going to take some of the money from Europe and that's going to substantially increase the funding for the NHS.
2 months before the referendum, then President Barack Obama sparked a backlash when he weighed in on the impending decision.
Maybe some point down the line, there might be a UK-US trade agreement, but it's not going to happen anytime soon because our focus is in negotiating with a big bloc, the European Union, to get a trade agreement done. And UK is going to be in the back of the queue.
It just confirmed both sides. Those who believe the UK should remain in the EU said exactly, just as Barack Obama said we should. Makes absolute sense. And those who thought the UK should leave said exactly. If somebody like Barack Obama's in favor of it, it must be a bad thing.
Anytime that a country is undertaking a decision that would be bad for the United States, we should make very clear what our position is. I'm sorry that Britain made the decision to leave the European Union. I think that's going to be very bad for Britain in the long run. I think it's going to be bad for Europe, and I think it's going to be bad for the United States.
When the votes were tallied, the Leave campaign had pulled a shocking upset. But a glance at the electoral map reveals glaring geographic divisions.
If it hadn't been 2016 in June, it's again unlikely that the referendum would have turned out the way it did. So what was causing that? Well, one was the migration crisis. In 2015, it peaked. Angela Merkel opened the doors in Germany to migrants who'd been flooding across from Afghanistan, from Syria, through 2 different routes into Europe. In addition, Europe itself was having a number of different policy problems. Remember, we had the economic recession of 2008.
You had these regional splits, these city-urban splits, and these age splits. So what you saw was places that tended to be older and have fewer people who went to university, you had more blue-collar jobs, they tended to vote Brexit, and the cities voted overwhelmingly for Remain.
Within hours of the announcement, David Cameron tendered his resignation as British Prime Minister. His replacement was a fellow Remainer, Theresa May, who now faced the impossible task of corralling a parliament whose members had wildly different visions of what a withdrawal agreement ought to entail.
She became a fairly sort of hard Brexiteer. She tried to negotiate a deal with the EU over time that was seen as sort of a hard Brexit. There was a standoff between the EU and the UK over the issue of the border in Northern Ireland, which became a real sticking point.
May eventually stepped aside after failing to rally enough MPs behind her deal. Instead, the Prime Minister who would lead Britain into a post-European future was the brash, controversial former mayor of London, Boris Johnson.
He took the reins in 2019 on a campaign full of promises to tear up Theresa May's deal. It was a whirlwind, but he did most of the things that he promised. He got the deal, and then before Parliament voted it through, he called a general election, and he won a huge majority on a campaign promising to get Brexit done. So in those 2 seismic events, the future direction of Britain changed dramatically, and the man at the heart of both campaigns was Boris Johnson.
In Northern Ireland, home to the United Kingdom's only land border, the mechanics of Brexit have reopened old wounds. The Good Friday Agreement of 1998, which ended 30 years of bloody conflict known as the Troubles, mandated an open border with Ireland.
We have to reconcile our commitments and obligations under the Good Friday Agreement, which is the basis for peace in Ireland and the development of the All-Ireland economy, for example, and also our obligations and responsibilities as a member of the European Union to protect the single market, protect the customs union.
Certainly for anyone in the Irish diaspora, and of course that includes quite a lot of people in the United States, they really do not want to see the UK renege on an agreement that may, because of the knock-on effects, end up creating some kind of hard border on the island of Ireland between Northern Ireland, part of the UK, and the Republic of Ireland in the south.
To undermine the Good Friday Agreement is for the UK not just to undermine international law, it's to undermine its relationship with the Republic of Ireland, with the rest of the world, but also to undermine its own national laws.
In Ireland, where the EU remains popular, some politicians and activists hope Brexit can rekindle the movement for a united Ireland.
I think Brexit changed things massively, as you know. And I think the conversation now about constitutional change, reunification, has broadened to the extent that it's not simply a Sinn Féin matter. This is now really a national question and a matter of national interest.
As in Northern Ireland, residents of Scotland voted overwhelmingly to remain. In Parliament, the Scottish National Party has been among the EU's most ardent champions.
It would be difficult anyway to sort of get the kind of agreement that will allow another referendum to go ahead. But certainly for a lot of people in Scotland, the polls will tell us they're quite ready for independence.
But Northern Ireland and Scotland were not the only places to vote Remain. By a margin of more than 700,000 votes, Londoners cast their lot with the EU.
There's no doubt that the spirit of London is very much against the spirit of Brexit, which can be seen in the votes in London, which were very much anti-Brexit.
A majority of the population of London is made up of ethnic minorities. Many immigrants, I think then probably very little attracted by a campaign based on the idea of national sovereignty and national tradition. And also I'm quite sure that many of them felt that the Brexit campaign was an anti-immigrant, sort of xenophobic campaign.
Now, it remains to be seen whether London can retain its position as Europe's financial hub in the post-Brexit world.
The City of London, the great financial institution, the British equivalent of Wall Street, was said to be in danger from Brexit because it was said that many banks and businesses would move away from London to the European continent because they wouldn't be able to do business in the EU. None of that has happened.
However much Brexiteers tend to talk about this new swashbuckling global Britain, inevitably means the making of walls and the dismantling of proximity. And as Britain walls itself off from the rest of the world, London suffers.
I don't think they will replace London, but what you see is, of course, that certain functions are moving from London to Amsterdam or to Paris or to Frankfurt. It's not that banks are leaving completely or that London will be finished as a financial hub.
During the referendum campaign, the two sides sparred over the prospect of a bilateral free trade agreement between Britain and the United States. Negotiations for such a deal got underway in May 2020.
They're going to have trouble with the European Union and exporting to the European Union if they change some of their standards to accommodate the US. And there are many standards, automobiles, electrical standards, even pallet size standards.
From the US point of view, farmers and manufacturers are quite keen to sell into the UK because it's a large market, a large consumer market. In fact, it's about a quarter of the whole EU market and is definitely something they would like to sell into. So I think there's a lot of mutual interest in a UK-US trade agreement, yes.
I don't think the United States should negotiate a bilateral deal with the United Kingdom before we've negotiated a deal with Europe. That's a very clear way to express to the world that we prioritize a strong European Union.
The United Kingdom is not as protectionist as the European Union. Our trade negotiations with the European Union don't include agriculture. That's been the big breakdown. But the United Kingdom is open to accepting U.S. protein supplies, if you will. Sort of the art of the deal, if you will. When you can't make a deal with everybody, make a deal with somebody, and who knows where it might lead.
Pro-Brexit politicians argued that leaving the EU could reinvigorate Britain's so-called special relationship with the United States. Opponents of Brexit charge that Britons must come to terms with their nation's diminished status.
When the US president meets with the European Commission president and the president of the council and the president of the presidency, the UK won't be there. So that's on the negative side of the ledger. On the other side of the ledger, we have to say Britain's role as an intelligence partner with the US, I think, will remain paramount, not least because of the technical capacities the UK has in the cyber and encryption and surveillance and intelligence side. So not just the sort of MI6, MI5, but GCHQ side, and the kind of Five Eyes, which of course, again, is entirely beyond Europe.
But the Republican view is now very different. It's different from that traditional US foreign policy position. It is pro-Brexit, defiantly pro-Brexit. You are seeing signs of Britain becoming a country to argue over among the two parties in the US. And that is a very difficult position for the UK to be in, because it has to start to manage those relationships and to try to push its interests as the parties in control change in Congress or in the White House.
Whether it's nationalism or globalism, some of these things are somewhat cyclical in their trends. But right now, at this moment, we have this grand opportunity where there's a reflection in two countries of a similar goal. And I think Brexit presents that opportunity for us.
At the heart of the Brexit debate is the question of how Britons view their own country. Proponents of Brexit have tapped an undercurrent of nostalgia for the glory days of the British Empire.
A lot of it was this previous mentality of the glories of empire, and we were told they need us more than we need them. And this whole idea, rule Britannia, Britannia rules the waves, Britons never, never, never will be slaves. So I think a lot of that kind of imagery, and even stuff about the war and Spitfires and the mentality of, we can do this. 2 world wars and 1 World Cup, I think they often say.
England has a deep common history, shared history with continental Europe. The Brexiters have wanted to invent a history in which it's always, and especially at the moments of greatest glory, standing aside from continental Europe.
I think it was a nostalgic vote. I think it was also sort of out of keeping with the world as it was becoming, because, of course, the world was not sort of going back to the 50s or 60s. It's a world increasingly dominated by large powers like the United States, China, India, and others. And Britain's role in that, I think, is quite problematic if it's sort of acting on its own outside of any bloc.
Advocates of Brexit have promised that it is still possible for Britain to be a leader on the world stage.
Britain has wanted to sort of try to raise its vision to a global world beyond Europe that has more growth opportunities. The emerging market of China and Vietnam and Latin America and the Gulf, and raise your sights from Europe, go to the world. We can become more successful economically if we, as a former British member of the European Parliament, who is a Eurosceptic, phrased it, we need to unshackle ourselves from the European corpse.
Whether Britain can remain a leader on the world stage is, I think, still within Britain's grasp. It's up to Britain, and it depends how it handles itself as it leaves the European Union. This is a country that will still have a seat on the UN Security Council and be the second biggest investor in defence capabilities in NATO, be a reasonable voice in the WTO and IMF, and is still a large economy, a top 10 world economy. But it's not the old Britain. It's not a global superpower.
I think the best way for them to do it is to try to be sort of the leader engine of cooperation between democracies globally, so to transcend those regional groups and to promote democratic cooperation between democracies in East Asia, in Europe, in North America on these common sort of challenges, and particularly in light of a rising sort of authoritarian bloc. There is some indication that that is where they're headed.
As Prime Minister, Theresa May was fond of proclaiming that Brexit means Brexit. But implementing the result of the referendum was never that simple. The contentious negotiations over the withdrawal agreement were only the first step. The hard work of delivering on the myriad promises made to the British people, economically, politically, and spiritually, will be even more difficult.
Great Decisions is America's largest discussion program on global affairs. Discussion groups meet online via Zoom and Google Meets, in person at community centers, libraries, places of worship, and homes across the country to discuss global issues with their community. Participants read the 8-topic briefing book, meet to discuss each topic, and complete a ballot which shares their views with Congress. To start or join a discussion group in your community, visit fpa.org or call 1-800-477-5836. Great Decisions is produced by the Foreign Policy Association in association with Thomson Reuters. Funding for Great Decisions is provided by the Herford Foundation, PricewaterhouseCoopers LLP, and the Nelson B. Delavan Foundation.